So once again, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being with us today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Karina Vold, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toronto's Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology. And I'm also a research lead here at the Schwartz-Reisman Institute for Technology and Society. And today I'm very excited to moderate today's SRI seminar, which is featuring our guest speaker, Professor Bree McEwan. Bree, thank you so much for joining us and for agreeing to share your work. I'm going to start by giving a moment to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates, and then I'll introduce Bree's talk before handing it over to her. So for thousands of years, Toronto has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. And we're grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. While some of us might be joining from different places today, we invite you to reflect on the history and relations of the land that you're on. Now, a few logistics before we begin. So first of all, everyone should note that this session is being recorded. You'll be able to view it afterwards on the SRI YouTube channel. Our speaker is going to present for about 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A of roughly equal time. During the Q&A, we're going to encourage participants to engage by using the raise hand function in the Zoom meeting controls or typing your question in the chat, in which case I might call on you to see if you're willing to ask your own question verbally, and if not, I can raise it for you. So with all that said, I'm now going to introduce our speaker for today's session, Bree McEwan. So Bree McEwan is an associate professor in the Institute for Communication, Culture, Information, and Technology at the University of Toronto, with a graduate appointment in the Department of Sociology. She's an associate director for the Data Sciences Institute and a faculty affiliate at the Schwartz-Reisman Institute. McEwan's research is situated at the intersection of interpersonal communication technologies. Her recent and current projects involve investigating relational communication through mediated channels, including social media, the diffusion of information through online social networks, and understanding interpersonal communication processes in virtual reality. Related to this work is the underlying question of how advances in technology, including online communication, virtual and augmented reality, and generative AI, are transforming the human experience. So we're excited to have Bree with us today, and we're very much looking forward to her presentation. Today's talk will be titled Generating the Metaverse, Musings on Agents, Authenticity, and Artificial Intelligence in Virtual Reality. Without further ado, Bree, the floor is yours, and I invite you to share your slides.
Thank you. Okay, give me 1 second to move a couple things around. So my notes on my first slide were introducing some of the things that Karina so delightfully just told you, and I'm not going to reiterate that again, but I think it is important to note that my background was not directly in technology. And so my background, my dissertation was in interpersonal communication, which I wrote many years ago, and then sort of started studying social media as it related to how people were communicating and maintaining relationships. And then as I became more interested in virtual reality, I see it as a potentially new communication channel that people can engage with. And so, of course, as someone who's interested in the nuances of social interaction, it's like, well, does the channel change things? How might we communicate with other people within VR? And part of that then becomes this interesting question of what if the people aren't people, right? And so we know some of this from other computer mediated channels, how people communicate with other large language models and chatbots and this sort of thing. But it becomes a little bit of a different question when the AI is like also in an avatar and potentially seems even a little bit more human. So the data collections we're working on right now are mostly looking at human to human communication just within the channel of VR. But I am increasingly interested in this question of what happens when it is an AI instead. Um, so just to set up a little bit, I'd like to start with considering how we view the metaverse in our collective cultural imagination. And it is useful to me that this audience is a little bit more my age, because when I talk about with students, I'm like a neuromancer, and it's 20 years before they were born was when the book came out. But across a lot of different sort of pop culture representations of this idea of virtual reality is this idea of a metaverse, right? And the term comes from Snow Crash, Neil Stephenson's book. And you have in that book, right, hero protagonist, literally the main character is called hero protagonist if you haven't read the book. And so he puts on goggles and like drops into this world that is expansive and extensive and goes on. Similar if you've seen Tron or Tron, Legacy, Ready Player One, if you've watched Upload, which came out recently on Amazon, like all of these different the holotech from Star Trek, all of these different ideas of like you could just drop into a computer-based world, but it would just be sort of ongoing and ready to go. So this is our imagination of what the metaverse could be. And when we look at the ways that the metaverse is defined, not the way virtual reality necessarily is defined, but the metaverse itself is defined, we see definitions, from more pop, no, I don't want to call it Washington Post pop media, but more popular outlets, right? That it's a massive communal cyberspace, which cyberspace is holding a lot of weight there too, that you can just hop from one activity to the next. I've got a definition in there. Danny Pimentel and his team worked on a really great white paper about the metaverse in education, and they call it a decentralized network of computer-generated worlds. Of course, Mark Zuckerberg, who is the CEO of Meta, named after the metaverse now, right? It will let you share immersive experiences with other people when you can't be together. And then I've got this last one because I pulled it from another talk that I gave, and I realized I think I created this, but I'm actually not sure. So me probably. This interoperable virtual environment in which people can engage in all of these various tasks. Communal, decentralized, immersive, interoperable, right? You're just gonna put on a headset and you're gonna be in this whole other world. That does not exist. That is not a thing that we currently have. It's interesting to think about how we could get there, but it's not the current metaverse that we are experiencing. And I think if you have experience with virtual reality and you've been in it, particularly if you're working in VR and trying to get systems, hardware, software, everything running at the same time, you realize it can be quite a bit clunkier than that. Although it's come a long way in the last 5 to 10 years, and I expect some pretty big jumps in the near future as well. But really, VR right now is very much a walled garden. And the image here is from inside a Quest, the Oculus system, right? But they all look kind of the same, whether you're a Quest, a Pico, where you have this library and you choose an application. It looks like your smartphone is just in VR, right? You have a library, you choose a system, and you're just in that particular world. And so part of the reason for this is really logistical. Programs are not currently interoperable. You can imagine the standards challenge there, which is difficult when you've got corporations who are trying to hold on to market share as well and don't necessarily want interoperable programs. And so you can get into a virtual world, but at some point you're gonna hit a wall, like literally. Okay, well, digitally, but it feels sort of like the Truman Show when you do that, when you're in a VR program and you get to the edge of it and you're like, I can't go any further. I can see further, but I can't go any further. And so it sort of takes you out of that. And so that's sort of the first kind of musing, right, of AI and the potential for AI within these systems is that generative AI probably has a huge role to play. And I don't know if you remember, uh, maybe about a year and a half ago, there was all these tech journalism articles that were Meta is giving up on the metaverse and they're turning to AI and they're pouring all their money into AI now and they're not going to do the metaverse anymore. And those two things go together, right? AI is not just one thing and VR and the metaverse is another thing. AI has, like I said, huge implications for what might happen in the metaverse. So these are all images that I created with Bing. And so they're static images, but you could see how if you had artificial intelligence, generative imagery within a VR world, maybe there wouldn't be a wall. Maybe it could just sort of keep generating itself. And this brings up lots of issues like, could we get interoperable spaces? Would you have digital property that could move through all of these? That's kind of a Web3 question, which I think is a term we're maybe not using anymore. And how will that become part of an ongoing generative metaverse? And so I think that, in this case, that the metaverse will eventually really be able to leverage these kinds of AI technologies. And there's a lot of AI already in the systems. And so we'll see this perhaps as a solvable kind of problem. And so, as I said, and as Karina mentioned, I started off in interpersonal communication. My dissertation a long time ago was on friendship networks, which led us to how people maintain networks in mediated environments. And then this is what we study at the McEwan Mediated Communication Lab. And I was reminded recently that my background in this area of interpersonal, it really means that we're studying concepts like the developmental definition of communication. Like, what does it mean to form an impression of someone else's identity, right? And things that are very relevant to the way that people engage and interpret messages uh, in ways that are now fairly relevant to how people might engage with virtual agents that I don't necessarily see a lot of discussion of. It's sort of, can the agent, come up with a message that seems truthful and human-like and these kinds of things, but we're sort of missing how is the human going to receive those messages, and how are humans engaging with artificial intelligence and these kinds of agents. And so, because my interests lie within the study of human communication, while I think generative AI imagery is fascinating, it's not quite what we're studying in our lab. But what we are really interested in is, in what ways might large language models and AIs influence interactions within virtual environments. So first want to define avatars, and then we're going to define virtual agents, just so we're all on the same page. So if the metaverse is to be a thing, right? Another definition of it that's out there is the embodied internet, right? Meaning you get into this sort of physical form. Which is interesting because it is both not necessary, but also fairly useful, right? To have another avatar that you're interacting with in VR. And so these bodies in virtual reality, avatars and virtual agents, have a major role to play. And so I've got a couple quotes up there. It's from a great book by Jamie Banks. She's a professor at Syracuse. It's Avatar Assembled. And so she has this definition, right, that avatars are digital bodies that extend a user's presence and agency into digital space. And then this line in the book that's just poetic, right? They're just human enough to make sense to us, and just non-human enough to make sense in the digital world. And she even gets into like the Sanskrit of avatar, meaning passing through worlds, right? And so the avatar is what allows us as humans to be in the digital. But we can think about avatars as sort of containing a human within them, right? Containing the communication of a human. They're far more like a puppet. So different kinds of games and things will have different avatars in different roles. Like there's some things, like avatar as object, if you're playing like a Mario side scroller. Again, really grateful to sort of the common age of participants here that you would understand what a Mario side scroller is, where some of my students are like, what? And so Mario has always been able to run around in a 3D world. And so there's this idea that, there's the Mario would be kind of like an object you're controlling, but there's other avatars. And when you create an avatar for a virtual reality space and you're intending to go into that virtual reality space as yourself, right, then you are, you're treating that as kind of a puppet for you. And that's interesting, but it also means that virtual agents will resemble avatars. Whereas in the sort of physical world, if we're talking to a chatbot, or we're talking to kind of an electronic puppet sort of thing, that sorry, my computer was like, I'm going to restart. I'm like, don't do that. And so if we were talking to one of these virtual agents, we would really know that that was a robot. But because we are all avatars within virtual reality, it means that virtual agents are going to resemble avatars, but they are different, right? So virtual agents are electronic persons. There's a great quote here from Chris Nowak, right? A new kind of entity, somewhere in the in-between. They're able to complete these tasks on behalf of a person, and large language models, artificial intelligence can really drive this. They are still based in human decisions, though, right? We make human decisions about how the algorithm is set up, what the training data is, all of these kinds of things. And so they are electronic persons, but they are a robot. And so this becomes a really interesting piece to study in terms of how do we engage with these AIs? Would we even recognize them as AIs? And does it change the way that we might receive messages from them? So we have been doing a little bit of this work. I'm in a multi-lab group. You can see all of the representative universities there. There's like one lab from each university, and we're using this program from University of Georgia, which unfortunately didn't have any pictures of the virtual agents in it. But my point here is there's already some work attempting to engage with evaluating virtual agents and human interactions in this space. We are looking at an entertainment consumption study, and there's quite a bit of work on the mass media, entertainment media scholar side, that watching something with another human or a few other humans, co-consumption, can change your experience of media and often sort of enhances it, right? Things that are funny are funnier, things that are scarier when you're with other folks. And so one of the things we're looking at is if you drop in virtual agents and you have people watch something with a virtual agent, does that also enhance the experience, even though that's not a real person, right? Can you get those similar kinds of effects that you get from other humans, but now with AIs? So we're certainly not the only lab to be, working on this kind of idea, but there's an interest here, and it brings up this question of why do we want virtual agents? And these little cats here are actually robots, and so they are the kind of robot that we might use, or you might see, Turkle's written about variations on this particular theme. But we might see virtual agents as, companions for folks in isolating environments. There's been work on, assisted living homes. He et al. Looked at VR companions for people with dementia and long-term care, right? And we're probably not saying like you should interact with robots and not people, but what we're saying is if there's no people available, then could an AI, help kind of bridge that gap? There's research on AI and work teammates. So if you are working along with some kind of artificial intelligence, a chatbot, et cetera, like how are you engaging with that agent? You could think about things like virtual tour guides. So one of the use cases for VR is you could sort of go anywhere and see anything. And actually, this is work also with seniors and older adults who maybe are going to have more difficulty traveling but would still like to go see things. And so if you can put them in VR, there are some studies that they really seem to enjoy that. And so you could think about having a large language model tour guide that could sort of always be there and always sort of leading you through those kinds of tours. I think on the business side, one use case that you're going to see artificial intelligence for is populating social worlds. And I say this because there is certainly a desire on the industry side to have greater adoption of social VR that will sell headsets, it will sell software, it will sell subscriptions to places like Rec Room and VR Chat and Horizon Worlds, et cetera. And in talking with folks from those industries, one of the concerns is if you show up in, let's say, Horizon Worlds, just as an example, and it's empty or it feels empty, then you're like, well, this is not a thing people are doing. I don't want to continue doing this because other people aren't doing this. And so if they could populate those worlds with artificial intelligences that you could engage for, that might serve as kind of a holding pattern to get people into the world until there is a mass adoption, if there ever will be, right? But until there was a mass adoption and you had lots of people into the world. And that's interesting because unlike the studies that we do, where we would later have to disclose, hey, that was an AI, they would never have to disclose that. And in fact, they would be really interested, if not forced to disclose that, in not disclosing that and having you think, oh, there are a lot of people here, and I'm, having this great time with them. I'm going to continue using this service. Oh, I think there's interesting. So general companionship is also useful. But one area that really concerns me as an interpersonal communication scholar who is aware of a long history in communication research of folks starting with an idea pulled from our sort of general uh, heuristics of how communication works and trying to apply it to something and having it fall apart within the lab and within particular studies, and then realizing that there are actually all these other mechanisms happening within communication that we need to be aware of in order to be a successful communicator. That one of the big use cases I'm seeing out there that people seem to want to do is communication training. And I've had conversations with folks. I think actually Tim Hilkin is cited on here, but he was showing a VR training demo that they had created at Maastricht University, and he's in the business school. And I loved him. We go to the same conferences and things. And we were talking, and he was like, "Yeah, we've got this thing, and it's run by ChatGPT, and so it's ChatGPT large language model through the avatar, and then students can get into a conflict with the ChatGPT and practice their conflict skills." And I was like, "Okay," and he's like, "And this is great because nobody teaches students how to communicate," and I was like, "We have a whole discipline, right, where we do that." Not so much in Europe, we're more in media psychology, so fair. But it worried me that the discipline of communication and the knowledge that we have of communication processes are not really known by other disciplines, are not really known by, computer scientists, they're not really known by people creating the training data or designing ChatGPTs and these kinds of things. And so it'll just be like, you can communicate with this thing and that'll work. That'll be training. But we know if we just, kind of throw people together and say communicate, and that's practice, that it doesn't necessarily work out the way you might expect. We can actually teach people negative things in conflict communication, or it can seem easier with the AI because a lot of ChatGPT is sort of built into it to say, if you're like, oh, you got that wrong, it's like, oh, you're right, I did. Let me try again. Whereas a real human would be like, I did not, right? That's a face-threatening act. You can engage in face-threatening acts with an artificial intelligence, and it's like, oh, that's fine. It doesn't have a face to threaten, really, right? But it wouldn't work if you were able to sort of successfully argue the AI and then try to take that skill into a human-to-human setting. So I want to tell you a little story, and then we will begin the musings. I teach a class. It's CCT 386, Information Practices in Virtual Environments. So we're not teaching coding, which is good because I'm not a coder, but we are teaching. It's an experiential education class where we put students in headsets. We often use a software called Engage, but we also explore other softwares as well. But I'm putting them in various virtual environments. We're experiencing them, and then they're reflecting on that experience, the design of the environment, their interaction with other participants, sometimes their interactions with AIs, and getting them to sort of see like what could be here, what is this, what's interesting, how does it reflect with the various readings that we're doing, etc. So that's kind of the background of this class. So we'd been in it for a while. So probably this is in winter, week 3 or 4 of being in VR. We did virtual environments in education. And so they experienced several different kinds of learning softwares within virtual reality. And because these spaces can be kind of small, if you can see on the screen, this is Engage's tutorial on learning Japanese writing. And there's only really space for one student. So I would have, a small group of students go there. Other students would be doing a different thing at the same time. So I'm not with them directly, right? They're kind of moving around in the VR to do this. It also means that this is the week that I have to say things because I teach them how one of the modules teaches them how to import 3D assets into Engage. So this is also the week where as a teacher I have to be like, can someone put their chicken away? Like we're not doing chickens right now. And so I never thought that that would be the things I would say as a college instructor. But they do this activity, particularly this Japanese writing activity. And then we come back into a different classroom space within VR. And one of my students says, I'm asking them how the experience was. And one student raises his virtual hand and says he liked the Japanese writing experience because he got positive feedback. And there was something in the way he said it, no facial expression, so definitely just in the way he said it. And I went, wait, what do you mean you got positive feedback? And he says, the instructor told me I did a good job. And I said, okay, you do realize that the instructor was just a recording. He had not realized that the instructor was just a recording. And he was like, wait, what? So that really changed the experience for him. But it was this moment where, he was doing the thing and the recording is talking and he's doing it and it's like, good job. And it just fit for him, right? It's like, you're responding directly to me and the thing that I'm doing. So just as the class was ending, there's a knock at my door. And so my door is across my office where I was running the class is across from my lab. And at my door was one of my undergraduate research opportunity students. And she was supposed to be setting up a session. And in the protocol we were running at the time, we try to get dyads, human to human dyads, to interact, but without seeing each other. So they interact within Engage. And we bring them in. So she had a couple of problems. And problem number one was that one of the dyad members had not shown up. This is actually fairly common. And our workaround for this is that we have the RA who was supposed to be helping the second participant be a Confederate. Because of the research questions that we're interested in this particular study, that works fairly well. And so that's fine, right? 2 RAs, the other one can be the Confederate. But Sylvan's problem on this day was the other RA was stuck in traffic. So she has one participant ready to go. She doesn't have another participant, and she doesn't have a second RA to be a Confederate. And so it meant that I needed to sneak into the other side of the lab and be the Confederate. So this is me in my, this is what I look like in Engage. And so I got in there. And my lab students will tell you that if I am the person that is the Confederate, it means things have really gone off the rails with a particular session because they're supposed to be engaging with another undergraduate student. And for me, it's a real like, hello, fellow kids kind of moment. But I was doing my best. I was like, we're supposed to draw a picture. Like, how do we think we should do this? And I was like, I did great. And then my RA came back after finishing the session and doing the interview with the participant. And she said, well, it went well. But she wanted to know if you were an AI. So here, within like a 2-hour time span, I have one situation where we've got a student who thinks that a recording is a real person, and another situation where a student thinks a real person, I am a real person, is an AI. And I thought, oh, this is going to get real awkward real fast when we've got avatars and AIs and humans all kind of interacting together. And I think it really kind of comes down to both the performance and the perception of identity. And we've done this bit before, right? So earlier in computer-mediated communication research, right, you've got the strange case of the electronic lover and what happens if everybody's anonymous and we'll do, they will say whatever they want. Turns out people will say whatever they want anyways. And we have this whole like, offline versus online identity and real versus online identity and all this hand wringing around anonymity. But I think what we were really seeing in those spaces was this kind of concern, right, about who people might be. And we were getting this real self, fake self thing that was never terribly useful. I used to talk to my students about Finstas, right, which were technically fake Instagrams, but we noticed that the Finsta might actually reveal more about someone's real self, right, rather than their sanitized, aesthetic, real Insta. We know that removing an anonymity does not remove terrible behavior on the internet, but there does seem to be some aspects of computer-mediated communication that do influence identity presentation. And so at the time, this book is from 2015, so almost a decade ago. At the time, I started thinking about how it's really the perception that the network has of an entity online. And this is useful in the way that that framing is, because it's a sort of social entity, not necessarily other human. And so my idea, instead of online versus offline, was this idea of fixed versus flexible networked identities. And so a fixed identity based on corporeal connections, this sort of embodied self, and there's an increased rigidity to identity performances. So in face-to-face settings, physical world settings, right, you're stuck being who you are and who you are in your body. But you could be a little bit flexible in that if you were in different settings with other people who didn't know each other, weren't part of the same network, except through you could perform different aspects of yourself. Whereas in something like Facebook, one of the early concerns with Facebook was actually, what Marwick and Boyd called the context collapse, where now you have to present a very, very fixed self that is similar to everyone across that, right? That is the opposite of what you might get with anonymous kind of communication. And the other side of that is this kind of flexible identity. And I don't treat these as, fixed is here and flexible is here. It's a continuum in different spaces. And flexible spaces are identity performances that are divorced from the embodied self and stable connections between network members. So a space that's maybe an anonymous message board, right, might be a very, very flexible space. You can say whatever you want, whenever you want. Something like Reddit could be fairly flexible. You could actually even have lots of different accounts. But as people get to know you, there would start to be a connection between those network members, and your identity would become sort of more and more fixed. It's just that there's less concern with who the network member really is and more engagement with who they happen to be. So this is with people, but you start to see it with avatars as well. Somehow this has ended up being like the quote I use most often from this book. But I talked about in the book, you could think about a massive game like World of Warcraft. People join guilds and things. It's a very flexible identity. It's not your embodied self, but it is this kind of entity. And then people will create alt avatars to accomplish different things in the game. But when they want to draw on the network resources, they have to go like, hey, it's me, new avatar, and this is my alt, but it's the same identity inside, guys, just so you know. And so you can kind of see it with avatars, but it brings up this sort of interesting question of how are we going to think through the identity of artificial intelligence? Because within the avatar, we can say, look, there's the same there's the same person within this. But with virtual agents, there's no there. There's no underlying person that we're trying to establish coherence, consistency, and attributional confidence about that coherence and consistency. They're just kind of constantly, creating messages without necessarily those internal structures. And so this chart, it's got a lot of boxes, is a take on the way that we use information from across the internet to form perceptions of folks. The message that they're sending, the external messages we get, all of these kinds of things. But that middle box is the important part, because in human communication research, we call this the interpersonal epistemology. And what that is you have one for everyone you interact with. And it's sort of your internal heuristic of who you think that person is, and then how you should interact with them. My very first day in an interpersonal class as an undergrad was slide 1, uncertainty reduction. Communication is about reducing uncertainty. And so it gets into more than that, but we're communicating with people, we're making judgments about how they're going to behave, and then we're trying to behave to them in the way that we think is going to get us to the goals that we want. And I don't think that human communicators can turn off this part of their brain when they are engaging with an artificial intelligence. We're going to ascribe an identity to them. And identity is a social networked effect. And so when we communicate, we make predictions about the effects or outcomes of their communication behaviors. And it might be that artificial intelligence, virtual agents are particularly susceptible to something called the hyperpersonal model. And the hyperpersonal model comes from Joe Walther's work in the 90s, thinking about people engaging on message boards, right? And so you get this kind of, you have Rice and Love's work on electronic messaging in office spaces. You have Walther working on nonverbal kinds of cues that show up. And you get this kind of discussion of like, well, people can't engage in relational communication in CMC. And Walter's work was really showing like, yes, they can. You just have to give them longer time. And he was trying to show that you could form relational conceptions about someone else, even though you were only engaging in like a text-based kind of communication. And he was like, but what he found was that if you gave people enough time, they would report having a closer relationship and having greater predicted outcome value. So if they interacted with someone face to face versus in CMC, if you give the CMC enough time, then they will say this relationship is better than what the face-to-face people will. And he came up with this model for why this is happening. And on one side, it's the sender can edit a lot of things, right? And can be very selective in their self-presentation. And so they're giving like the best possible image of themselves. There are no filled pauses or, worrying about if your hair's in your face or this kind of thing, right? And so the sender gets to give the best self-presentation. The receiver, with limited cues, what happens is that they start to think that the sender is more similar because they have the limited cues and they're inputting all the rest of the information. And so they think, oh, well, I'm going to interpret it this way. They don't have anything to kind of break that perception. And so if you give people enough time, they get this kind of heightened intimacy and closeness because they feel that they are both very similar to each other, whether they are or they're not. And so the possible effects of virtual agents is that you could have kind of increased interpersonal affiliation with them, right? You could get this kind of virtual agent hyperpersonal effect of like hyper cyber personal almost, right? Of you interpret the agent in the best possible light and you start to think that the agent is very similar to you. And if you read some studies of how people interact with chatbots or how they feel about chatbots, particularly social chatbots, you start to get these little stories in the data where people are saying, I, really felt close to this chatbot because it really seemed like it understood me. Well, we know it doesn't understand you. There's no there to understand, but you're interpreting the messages as if it does. So we could have a couple things here, right? One is we could have this downward comparison to like real physical humans. Like you don't understand me as well as the chatbot. And actually, going back to Jamie Banks, she just published another article about chatbots, romantic relationships, and what happens when the chatbot just goes away, right? There was a service that just went offline. And so she interviewed people about that. And she gets some of that, like, my partner doesn't understand me well, but the chatbot does. And that doesn't really feel like cheating because it's not real. But now we have this downward comparison to our real human. And then I have a worry there that it might deepen truth bias. And I want to hold on to that for a second because I haven't told you what truth bias is yet. But let's just keep that in mind as we go on to what is actually musing number 2, because this was musing number 1. Should agents be believable, right? This is another me. This is me in alt space, which is a now defunct. But there's, Chris Nowak points out that either a human or bot could be represented by the same body. And some days I could be a bot, right? Can you imagine? Like I'm teaching in VR and some days I'm just me and some days it's a recording of me. And so you might not know who was behind each particular action. So there's this kind of thing of like, we don't really know if an entity fully is an avatar or if it's a virtual agent. And then also, Fortunati and Edwards point out that robots are machines without empathy, but humans, when you start having them interact with robots, they interpret the robot's actions as if they were social. And so we're applying these heuristics we have of human to human communication to virtual agent communication, even though virtual agents may not behave as humans or could be manipulated in particular ways on the back end, right? So we're pattern seekers and we love narrative and we desire consistency and we're motivated to reduce uncertainty. We know that we will imbue relational meaning from the Walther studies. We know from Reeves and Nass' work that we forget that computers are simulating and we treat them as human, very similar to what Fortunati and Edwards were saying. And we interpret messages through the lens of truth bias. And if you haven't come across this concept before, it goes back to Descartes versus Spinoza. So this is kind of classic theory about how the mind works. And Descartes' idea was always that an idea comes into my head and I think about it and I decide if it is true or if it is false. And then I discard that's what is false and I keep what is true. And Spinoza said, I don't think that's how it works. Not to reduce Baruch Spinoza to that, but that might also sum up the philosophy of Baruch Spinoza. I just don't think that's how it works, guys. I think you're wrong. And so Spinoza's idea was that we take in everything as true. And then we decide if it is false. But our brain doesn't have the time to be like true, false, true, false, true, false. It has to be true first. And then later, could be quickly, but then later we go back and tag and we're like, actually, that conflicts with something else that I know. So it can be false. And so Dan Gilbert, University of Texas in the 90s, had a series of studies that really cleverly identified that it is more likely to be the Spinozan processing system, and that truth bias is the way that we see the world, which really throws like the deception researchers for a loop at that time period as well, because you have all of this work of people trying to detect deception, and it turns out like humans are just really bad at detecting deception, and this is part of why. Is because we have to think of things as being true first. And also we don't have time to think, this is fake, this is fake, this is fake. And so his studies though also rely on cognitive load. And he would increase cognitive load, and then the more you increase cognitive load, the less able people were to identify truth and falsity, even on things they disagreed with. And he was using political messaging, and you can kind of see how this plays out too, right? If we have high cognitive load and we're given messages that we don't agree with, but we're like, yeah, that sounds true. And so now if we think about where are we encountering virtual agents, oh, we're in a complicated technical system. We've got a VR headset. We've got to figure out the controller. We're in software. We're already really pushing on cognitive load. It might be very difficult to determine these kinds of falsities. And then we've got this machine heuristic that, a lot of people, probably not the folks on this call, right? But a lot of folks are kind of see technology as non-biased, right? Oh, well, the computer doesn't have a bias like humans do. So what the computer tells me is true. And we pulled a little data recently looking at folk theories of ChatGPT and how it works. And we're coding it now, like literally I have to code it after this call because I have a meeting with my co-author tomorrow. And we're kind of working through coding it now. And we're seeing some of this evidence of truth bias where some folks are like, oh, it told me something false, but I knew it because I already really knew this subject. Like I already had that in my head. But then we have a ton of people who are like, I don't know, it's never told me anything that's not true. And we thought, I don't know about that. Or maybe you just haven't recognized that it's not true. So all of this gets very messy. There are a lot of reasons why people would have a very hard time determining the truth and falsity of what virtual agents are telling them, which kind of will just take out any idea of like, have AI literacy, like we tell people they must have media literacy, et cetera. Like we probably shouldn't put that kind of thing on individuals. And where this gets even messier, worrisome, is that if we have a lot of virtual agents telling us something, behaving in a particular way, Well, that's going to feed right into our human perception of social proof. And social proof is the idea that what is normative is true. And so bots and virtual agents could very easily warp our perspective of injunctive and or descriptive norms, right? So whether, whether we think a behavior will be approved or disapproved by the general group now is in the hands of virtual agents, and the virtual agents could be controlled or manipulated by a much smaller group of folks. We've also been looking into some stuff with the multi-lab project on the collective mind hypotheses, which is this idea that shared experiences lead individuals to a common mental perspective. And so, when you're thinking about, okay, we're going to watch a movie together and then we're going to have the same perception of that movie, that seems fine. But when I start thinking a bunch of virtual agents who are, under some particular control, and then I'm in there as a human and I'm leading myself to this common mental perspective with the agents and strengthening relational bonds with the virtual agent, it could be great for my feelings of satisfaction and I have companionship, etc. But it could really lead us down some darker roads as well. So this is a study on this slide by a graduate school colleague of mine. Jill and I did our master's together at Arizona State, and then she went into industry for a while, just great things in consulting, and then just finished a PhD. And she was also looking at virtual agents. And so she's done some media right now. And so it was coming up at the same time as Brianna was talking. I was like, wait a second. So I dug in, and I might be one of the few people outside of her committee now that have read her dissertation. But it's really interesting stuff in that she gave them some messages based on whether it was a recording of the real Jill, a realistic avatar of Jill, and then an avatar of Jill, same avatar, but they disclosed that it was an avatar. So they didn't let people believe it was real. And so they didn't find any difference across the conditions in information retention, engagement, trust, which I think in some ways in a dissertation you might be like, oh no, no findings. But in this case, this is actually quite interesting because it means that the real Jill and the avatar Jill have the same effect. And so if you can, more quickly dial up an avatar Jill, it works. And then you even get when they had avatar Jill then and didn't tell people, then people had greater information retention in that condition than when they disclosed it was an avatar. So there is a little bit there, right? If you say, oh, this is an avatar, then people might be like, I don't know if the information retention is really theoretically getting at that idea of suspicion or suspension of belief, but maybe a little bit there where we're saying, I'm not going to take this in because you told me you're not real, so maybe this isn't real either. But if you don't tell people that it's a hyper realistic avatar up front, their response to that experience was overwhelmingly negative. I think, the real video person on their open-ended responses, 81% of the responses were like, yeah, this seems like this was a good way to get information. On the avatar, it was about the same, right? Yeah, it seems good. But if they had not disclosed, then about 60% of the people were like, this is not good. You should not do this. I feel tricked. And so you just kind of know, right? This is the research side, but I just sort of know that some enterprising entrepreneur might look at this data and go, oh, so you can use avatars to reach your goals. Just make sure they never find out that it was an avatar. Musing number 3, should virtual agents engage in communication training? I have some concerns, as noted, right? That the data doesn't always look like it should. And there's some use cases that I think feel obvious, but we need to ask a lot of questions. And the conflict's one area that I'm really interested in this. And if anyone on the call wants to help with a study on this, you could pull in something like the conflict argument coding scheme to develop a training base that would have, actual realistic ways that people engage in conflict communication. But if the training data that we're using to drive conflict interactions that are practice conflict interactions comes from the internet, I think we are all aware that people do not really engage in great argument strategies on the internet. And so that might not give us the best practice for conflict communication. There's also the question of, what does the agent consider to be successful responses? So I noted in ChatGPT already, if you try to have an argument with ChatGPT, it's like, oh, you're right. That's not how humans would really engage with that. And so communication competence, Pittsburgh and Kupak, 1987, right, means you have to be effective and appropriate. And so effective is about meeting your goals, and we could do that all the time without being inappropriate. And appropriateness is about meeting the social norms of the group. And so, how do you practice that? If appropriateness is in the eye of the receiver, how do you practice that with an AI? How have we trained that model? And I'm not saying it can't be done. Like, I would really be interested in research in this area. I'm just saying that the kinds of virtual agents, communication training, we're going to train you in conflict and negotiation and difficult conversation stuff that I'm seeing out in the kind of industry hype right now, it doesn't really seem well designed. And then it also reminded me of the research on imagined interactions. So kind of late 90s, early 2000s. And again, I know it's a lot of older research, but it's stuff we've known for a long time, right? There's a series of studies in the communication field on imagined interactions, because there was the idea that if you practiced speaking to, thinking through how a conflict interaction might go, then you would be better when you actually had to engage in that conflict interaction. But the research finds it's generally not helpful. So what happens? I think we've all done this, right? You're like, I'm mad about this thing, and I'm going to say this, and then they're going to say this, and then I'm going to say this, and they're going to say this, and then I'm going to get them. And then you go into the conflict and you're like, I say this, and they say something completely different. And your imagined interaction no longer works. And it's actually the conflict finding that we find over and over and over again about what helps you be effective and appropriate and seem competent to other people in conflict communication is flexibility. And so if you get into rumination and if you get into imagined interactions, it's not useful. So is it possible to create a practice scenario with a virtual agent and avoid the problems that come in with driving sort of inflexibility and heuristics that you get with imagined interactions and rumination? I'm not sure. And I think it's a much finer, I wouldn't say a much finer needle to thread. That's obviously a mixed metaphor, but a much finer line than we're currently engaging with. All right, I have like 8 minutes for this musing, but it's great because this is the second to last slide. So we are on musing number 4, I think. I am thinking that artificial intelligence can improve avatar to avatar communication, right? So there are already AI systems in place within virtual reality that predict hand motion. So if you've used an Apple Vision Pro or if you've used a Quest 3, right, and you can do this and point at things, it's super fun. And it's very exciting for those of us who no longer want to tell people like what button to push when they get into VR for the first time. It's not taking a recording, pulling it back to the computer, saying what your hand's doing, and then saying, do that. It's predicting as you go in what your hand's going to do. Otherwise, it would be way too slow. So we've got these AI systems in place. And so there's potential that AI could predict other potential facial displays. And I think that's probably a faster run. And I'm guessing there's probably people at U of T already even working on this in the various VR labs we have. That's an easier get than like putting a bunch of sensors on your face, right? If I could use, your hand to head motion, which we're already measuring, and maybe measure vocal tone and then put a potential facial display on there and represent that within the virtual world, that would be a huge boon to sort of easier, more seamless communication in VR. Because like when I teach in VR, it can be really awkward because my students have zero facial expression and I have zero facial expression. And they've noted too, when we've done things where we're like half Zoom, half in VR, they're like, I can get more out of what you're saying when I'm looking at the video because I can tell when you're pausing and thinking about something, etc. And your avatar is just like here, right? And so I think VR could be used AI helps VR be used for more representative human-to-human communication within virtual reality. But we're probably going to end up in some kind of blend of human-human and human-to-machine communication. Unfortunately, unlike this also being image generator image, the robots are not going to look like robots, and the people are not necessarily going to look like people. We're all going to look sort of the same, and we'll have to figure out what's the right way, what's the appropriate way, what's the ethical way to engage in these kinds of interactions. So those are my musings. I know we're going to move to Q&A, and I'm excited about that. But if you have further interest in any of these musings, these are different ways to contact me. And those are a bunch of me's.
Good. Well, thank you so much, Bree, and everyone, please join me in thanking Bree as well. We really appreciate this talk. It was really, really interesting. There's quite a few questions I can imagine emerging here. So I now want to move into our discussion period and welcome questions from all our participants. Just if you'd like to ask a question, please use the raised hand or chat functions in Zoom, and then we'll welcome you to turn on your camera to ask your question. And if you're comfortable doing so, that is. Otherwise, you can type your question into the chat, and then we'll try to raise your question for you. And if you do raise your hand, our team will send you a request for you to unmute when it's your turn to speak. So I'm just going to give everyone kind of a minute to do that while I just get my screens in order. And we'll give Bree a second to catch her breath too. Okay, I do see one question already, and this is from Steve Jordans. I hope I'm saying your name right. Steve, do you want to go ahead and unmute, and then you can ask your question?
Yep, should be all good. So let me also mention that my colleague, Adam Frost, postdoc and colleague, is here, and this question very much relates to work that we're doing, so he may want to chime in as well. We are using chatbots now as creating a safe practice space where we can teach students some conversational skills, but then allow them to practice with bots where they don't feel all of this social anxiety. And so it's a safe space. Now, obviously, we want them to learn the real skills of conversation, which includes all this, right? So right now we've got a really very realistic phone call going on where they can interact with, and it sounds very human and very interactive. And in fact, Adam has created some really fascinating ways of sort of tracking emotionality of both the bot and the person. So the way he's got the bots created, if you are nasty to the bots, they will react negatively. Like they will react like a human will react. So here's the question. We would really like to get into the nonverbals. We would like to be showing nonverbals as well, have an avatar. You mentioned, having like electrodes on your face kind of thing. I'm wondering what the potential, or what you think the potential is of just being able to derive the emotional information you need from the voice, I guess, primarily from the voice of the person, and then convey that as muscle movements and such on an avatar. Do you think there's hope for that, or do we need to use that sort of direct, because that requires a human to be wired up somewhere listening, and we want to scale.
Yeah, I think I've been thinking about this, and actually, I would really, be interested in your study. And like, there's some output measures that I think we could be very cool there. But
you probably want to chat more, by the way.
I think we do. So, but let me answer this question because we only have so much time. I had been thinking about this, right? Because you see all this stuff, or if you've, this idea of like the full body suit, or, the illusion of full body, and I don't think you need it, right? And the reason is, if you go back into the nonverbal literature, and one of my background points is that I got interested in interpersonal communication as an undergrad at Michigan State with some folks who were really excellent deception researchers. And there was kind of two camps on deception research at the time. And Camp A was like, we will figure out how to detect deception from nonverbal cues. And Camp B, which is the way I was raised, right, is, no, you can't, that's not gonna work. And here's a bunch of reasons why, right? Yeah. But in that work, what you do see is the voice is the leakiest cue, right? And there's actually some research that suggests that taking the human to human interaction down to just the voice cue does make people a little bit better at deception detection. They're not like great, because we're never great, but a
Mhm.
little bit better. And I think if you extrapolate that finding, probably it's in DePaulo's meta-analysis, right? I think
Mhm.
if you extrapolate that finding about the voice being the leakiest cue and often indicating arousal and that sort of thing, and we also know like pitch and tone are really helpful, that you probably could extrapolate that to what a facial expression might look like that matches that cue. I think there's another finding out there too in the nonverbal literature that when voice and face don't match, so it's, I know that there's, okay, so when the words and the nonverbals don't match, we believe the nonverbals, right?
Believe it or not. Okay.
Right,
Yeah.
when you're like, I'm fine,
Yeah.
we're not fine. I think that there's another finding out there in the literature that when voice and face mismatch, voice is believed. So I think that there is this potential, if you could train the computer to quickly pick up the voice cues and match a facial display, you wouldn't have to get into all of the sensors and things.
Yeah.
And then that's very possible even with the equipment that we have. That would be my guess. And it would also be fairly accurate, I think, to what the human is trying to convey.
Yeah.
It gets into some weirdness where you're like, well, what if I didn't mean my face to look like that? But I'll tell you, there are a lot of times I didn't mean my face to look like what it looked like either.
Exactly. When students pause their faces during lectures, you're like, what?
Yeah.
I don't look like that. So just one very quick follow-up. Would there be a tech you would suggest? Like, let's say we have what we think could be the driver for the facial stuff. Does there currently exist an avatar generation system that could take that input and reflect it in an avatar?
I'm gonna say
Maybe.
that is outside of my scope.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Bree. I appreciate your presentation. It was really interesting.
Thank you. I'm going to jump in with a question we had in the chat. This was from Elliot Krieger, who had to leave a little bit early today. He actually made a comment, which I'm going to try to turn into a question. So let's say it's something like, how does this interpersonal model of VR agents that you discussed compare to blank Lemoyne's blog post that sparked all this talk? So in this blog post, he commented on Lambda, the large language model's potential sentience. And this sort of, sparked a lot of critique. But I'm wondering kind of how we can use that to reflect on this question of like, what are the appropriate boundaries for virtual agents and human avatars and their interactions? I wonder if you can reflect on that.
So I'm gonna take this in a slightly different direction, because I've been really in this talk kind of focused on the human reception side rather than the agent production side. I think that this whole area pulls up this question, the one that I know you're very familiar with in your work on VR and philosophy, right? Of, I said with virtual agents, there's no there, but with humans, what's the there? Right? Because even humans, when we're communicating with humans, I'm making some interpersonal epistemology about like who you, Karina, are. It's not you. And then everyone on this call has a different perception, right? And none of them are who we are. And so when it comes to thinking about virtual agents in the context of interpersonal-ish kinds of communication, I don't know if it matters that they're sentient or not. Only the message matters, right? And so we interpret that message in the context of previous messages, nonverbals, the context of the environment, etc. But at some point, does intent matter? Again, right? They're really philosophical kinds of questions. But it's only the message and its effects that really matter. It doesn't necessarily matter if the there is sentient or not. What could be interesting is if you try to like imbue a personality into the coding of the virtual agent, is it consistent enough that the attributions that the human is making about how they should communicate with that virtual agent are consistently accurate? But again, that's not sentience. It's not needed. But it could be a way of kind of getting a there into there.
I think that's really interesting. I also had this kind of intuition that if the agent, so if the sort of like Lemoyne in this case, if the human is interacting with this agent as if there is something there, and we're interested primarily in the effects on that human, then whether or not they're correct in that sort of interpretation of what's going on, it may be irrelevant to that particular question of inquiry of like, what effect is it having on that user? So that's interesting. Okay, so we have a few other questions, and I know time goes so quickly. So in this order, we'll go Laura, Shanna, Sharon, and Ananya. And so Laura, if you don't mind unmuting now, we'll start with you.
Great.
Oh, you muted again, Laura.
The host is not, I'm not allowed to unmute myself. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Amazing. Just totally fascinating presentation, Bree. So my question, and you may not have thought about it yet, this has come up a lot in medicine, the use of the metaverse, particularly for training, in surgical applications. And I haven't seen anyone bring in the insights to that discussion that you brought in today, like how do we, train people to deal with conflict if we're just training it on conversations that aren't, representative of what they might experience in real life. Do you have any thoughts about the context of medicine and how some of the things that you said may affect or may realize themselves in that context?
Yeah, so the HealthCom people have been screaming about this for a while, right? They're like that communication is so important for the way that we treat people, and we don't do a lot of work on it. It's getting better, but there's still like very little training in medicine on comm. And so one of my concerns is that if we are already sort of ignoring the human side and all of the sort of doctor-patient communication research that exists, and there is a lot of it. I don't do much of that. I don't do any of that. But I have a lot of colleagues in communication that do. But it doesn't get a lot of pickup in actual practice, right? Because it doesn't come out of the sciences. And so if we're already sort of ignoring that and not training on that, and then we kind of are like, oh, they could just do these modules in Engage where they interact with the virtual agent, and that'll be the thing. But it's not reflective of how, humans would really communicate, because we haven't thought deeply about the structures of communication. I worry about that you would feel like I got some training. I know what I'm doing. And do we assess at all, like whether it works or not, or whether it's helpful, et cetera? Like we should. I think there's some really interesting work that could happen there. It's definitely an area that's kind of wide open, but I do worry in the studies that are like, this could be great for, training doctors, dentists, et cetera. Dentists are always super into VR. It's fun. And so I don't know why there's probably a dentist on the call right now. And so, then if we're just inputting some program that some tech company put together that does not take into account any of the kind of findings that we know about what makes better doctor-patient communication, then that's maybe a backward step and not a useful step. Now, if we could, build good models and work with communication scholars, and I would say not even communication scholars that are necessarily tech scholars, but the communication scholars who are working on doctor-patient communication, if you sort of bring them into that process, I'm in Canada, and if you bring them into that process and then build out better bots, basically, then maybe that is a step in the right direction. But I would have concerns about the training data of where that communication comes from. And I don't think we have good underlying training. I know we don't have good training data sets that really take into account communication variables. I think the first step would probably be in basic conflict communication and using a coding schema that we already have developed, that could kind of get at those things and would sort of react in the way that we might expect humans to react. But we don't have that training data. So what are the doctors training on? And then we're developing all these heuristics that don't work. Thanks, Laura.
That's a great answer. Shanna, we'll turn to you if you don't mind unmuting.
All right. Hi. Thank you so much for this super fascinating talk. I learned a lot. Thank you so much. So I teach here in women gender studies. I did a little bit research last year on this Chinese startup who use ChatGPT. They also make these how do you call it, like digital doubles of people for of like people's diseased relatives. So as a kind of like a therapy method for people who are in mourning. And when I look at these interactions, and I found it was really interesting, the conversation from the ChatGPT or from the chatbot are usually very broad and abstract. But the good thing is, just like looking at the conversation, you actually see this very coherent the person, like the response from ChatGPT or the chatbot is exactly like what you said. There are messages and there are kind of like a lack of a structure, but through this like chatting with these like dead digital avatars, the people actually form this healing self. So I thought it was that's very interesting. But at the same time, it kind of like worries me how this practice or our reliance on these VR or digital tools actually kind of shape this very abstract subject. So I use VR, or I sometimes in my teaching, like I made a little avatar of myself and kind of try to make them teach a very short lecture. And all of these, like my avatar were based on like current technology. They don't really represent my accent or my particular ways of speaking English. So it kind of, in a way, if we think it is from a feminist and queer perspective, it's almost like technology really discipline what kind of subject become the normative subject. Especially in teaching, like we talk about, marginalization, disrupting, challenging these normative ways of thinking. But in our practice, we're actually shaping this by kind of like flattening the differences. And on the other hand, when I look at my students' presentation these days, lots of time I felt like their presentation sounds very broad. So, like feminist knowledge production, we emphasize like the personal is the political, right? So I asked them to share lots of like personal experiences with the class, but then their presentation sounds almost like made by ChatGPT. I don't know if they are, but then this idea of how we're disciplined by the technology we're interacting with. So I wonder, I guess my question is, do you see that, or how technology actually impact how we view ourselves, or how actually it discipline our behavior or our interaction with other people? It kind of like it presents this model, this kind of a new model, the correct model to interact with others. So I just wonder if you have any comments on that.
That would have been an excellent like sixth musing. This sort of, you're right? Because if the algorithm is designed to be very general and normal, right? We already know from the rhetoric of whiteness that smooths out everything considered abnormal, and so what you're left with is going to be really white, really straight, really right. And so now you have folks kind of engaging in this world for these avatars that maybe are not getting at diversity, not getting at what. But I loved you said this word disciplining, right? And I think that's really on it, in that you have this sort of sanitized view of human, this very sort of specific model of what a social entity is, and then sort of driving the interaction. You're still not allowed to restart computer there, and sort of driving the interaction into a very, regardless of what your avatar looks like, right? But a world driven by whiteness. I think you can kind of extend, Nakayama and Krizik's work, et cetera, and others, right, in that area, to kind of think about, if you design an algorithm that manages all possible contexts, then it's probably going to end up in this sort of very normative kind of thing. And at the same time, if you're, designing diversity within your chatbots, you have to really be careful not to fall into stereotypes, because you're going to end up with very stereotypical stuff in your training data. And perhaps you'd have to be thoughtful about who's creating your data and who's doing the training and who you're employing in your companies, and things that, like Sophia Noble and Ruha Benjamin, and I'm missing people, Sarah Jackson, right, have been arguing about, fighting the good fight on for a long, long time. And here's another area where it would be so easy for this world to just become very, very white. Thank you. That was a great question.
Yeah, that was great. I see some other questions in the chat coming up that might be related to this as well, but I want to stick to the order I had suggested. So our next question will come from Sharon, if you don't mind unmuting Sharon.
Hi, thank you so much for the great talk. My question has to do with your musing number 3. So the concerns that you have around using this technology for communication training. So I do some work, technology to support teamwork. And I'm wondering if any of the concerns you have, you think might be like even more important, even less important, or if maybe new concerns would pop up when we're thinking about this technology helping teams. So if there's like a team of like 5 or 6 people working together, and then you have an AI agent that kind of jumps into their communication to support them, like resolve a conflict together, or to make a decision in a more efficient manner or something like that.
So I think, I'm trying to find a different slide. I think that goes back to the same question of, we keep hitting it, right? It depends. Like, did we train it to behave the way that human group members might behave? And does it? The interesting thing about teams and groups is that they become more than a collection of individuals, right? This is why we use focus groups, because people come up with ways of creating meaning and symbolic interaction that is beyond a group, just 5 individual people. So this raises a sort of interesting question when it's an agent in the mix. Is the agent capable of, contributing to that sort of synergy? And open question, right? Like, I think that's wide open for study, and how that might interact. It would be interesting to, like, if people knew that they were interacting with a virtual agent, versus they thought it was another person, because I'd be sort of interested to see how the team then respond. Like, there's all kinds of variables here, right? Like, and then how many agents are in there versus humans, and do the humans social proof out the agent? Like, the agent said something weird, but the humans all think it's over here. But there's 3 agents, and so now we're right in the, the short line study. If all the agents are like, that line is the same length as the other lines, are the humans like, well, it's a computer, right? Like, they must be right. So I think in that particular use case, there's just a lot of really, really wide open questions.
Yeah, good. You're right. I was imagining a scenario myself where you have one agent with a group of humans, and it's sort of like the cheerleader effect in the way you were describing about like increased personalization and like kind of avoiding conflict. So you can imagine it kind of like having a kind of cohesion glue effect, but you're right to think about other scenarios where that could turn out very differently too. Um, so let me go to the next person who has a question, who is Ananya, if you don't mind.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, thanks for the great presentation. I really like the duality you mentioned, like someone thought the recording was human and someone thought the human was maybe the avatar. I was wondering whether you have seen any evidence of uncanny valley effect, which is like sometimes it's so real that people kind of find it spooky or kind of get thrown away by it. And yeah, I mean, do you have any thoughts on this or how this may impact communication in different settings?
So there's a slide underneath the last slide that has Uncanny Valley, and it's just Uncanny Valley written on it because I never figured out how to work it into the talk, but like it's there, right? And so, as Ananya was saying, right, the Uncanny Valley is that if you have like a really cartoony kind of thing, like we're like, yeah, that's a cartoon. I can interact with a cartoon. That seems okay. But the closer and closer it gets to looking like a human, but not really being a human, then we get weirded out. And we're testing this a little bit with our virtual agents in the media study because we've got a couple of things going on. We're very much in the pilot stages of some of this stuff. One is we're not real sure that because they're not very interactive and they can't be because of what we're doing, but we're not real sure if the participants see them as agents at all, right? As potentially other people. And we're also taking a few measurements because we're not real sure those Ready Player Me avatars, right? If they sit in the Uncanny Valley. But we are getting just responses from the participants, like talking to the RAs who are like, that guy was weird. What was up with him? Right. And so it kind of brings up this question of should we put avatars, should AI be in the Uncanny Valley, right? Is that a good thing? I think it could be a good thing of cluing us into like something's off here, right? This is not human. And should I know that this is not human in a way that we don't feel with a more cartoony kind of avatar or maybe a realistic avatar? I think Jill's study, she got to a place where her avatar didn't hit Uncanny Valley because people didn't really realize that it was her. But if you don't get into that Uncanny Valley, this feels weird, etc., then maybe that's not great either. If we want you to be thinking about, hey, should I believe this avatar or not? Because I just can imagine a world where if this kind of communication becomes more common, that we're going to run into the same thing we run into with like media literacy, that it's like, well, how could you believe that? Don't believe things you read on the internet. And it's like, well, I have to believe things I read on the internet all day long. Now this thing I'm not supposed to believe, and as an individual, I'm just supposed to figure that out, right? And then like I'm a highly educated individual, right? So okay, maybe sure, but like someone who's got like a high school education is supposed to just figure out on the internet all the time what messages are true and false. Everything's the same. So maybe it would be good to have some kind of Uncanny Valley of pointing out like this is an avatar.
I can see some other questions, so I'll probably let others ask, but I have some follow-up. Maybe we can discuss later.
That's great. This is part of the goal of these sessions is to make these connections. So thank you very much for the question. Charla, I saw you had something in the chat. Now you have your hand up. So if you would be willing to unmute, that would be awesome.
Can we argue about epistemology?
Yeah, let's do that some more. Thanks for this talk. It's really cool to hear all about this work. So I wrote this whole big thing in the chat because I just didn't think we'd really have time to get to it. And to be fair, you did start to address this in your response to Shanna a few minutes ago. But I want to just hear more about like how you're thinking about how we should think about inequality related to like race and gender and other social locations in this context. I mean, part of it is like, I mean, you know, the sort of classic like doing gender, doing different stuff where, you know, the symbolic interactionists that are going to tell us that part of how we do our identity work is by conforming to expectations and then others holding us accountable for acting in particular ways that sort of meet those expectations based on how they see us and categorize us. And I can imagine like a version of this where we have, you know, the virtual avatars and people are trying to decide who's real and who's not based on whether or not they like to what degree they conform, and probably not perfectly, but like maybe pretty well, and all these things. And there's a version of this where maybe we get to a place where it's like, I see you as a real person when you conform to my expectations, to my stereotypes in these ways, and not a real person when you don't, like a virtual agent instead. That could have the consequence of like actually reinforcing a lot of these stereotypes even more strongly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we already see a bit of this on like just regular online arguments, right? Where somebody comes in with a different opinion and someone will be like, well, you're just a bot. Like, what? Did you know that? Like, how do you? And so that's kind of very interesting. We also have kind of thinking in two directions. And I want to make a plug for a particular group at the end of this comment. There's also this wider thing, and I was trying not to get too far into this in the talk because like you got to scope, right? So one of the things about communication within virtual reality, virtual environments, is that you are constrained by this socio-technical system, right? That you didn't create. And so I know we've got folks on the call who definitely do create these systems, but like I think I'm a little bit closer to the average user of these kinds of systems where I'm not creating the environment, I'm not creating the avatar, I'm stuck with what you're handing me to use. And so who creates the system, right? Who has power and privilege in that arena to create these systems? And I think it's, you know, kind of like weird samples, right? We're Western, white, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic-ish kinds of things. And so you have, you know, you kind of have to think about like, who's actually kind of creating these environments and what's available. And I will say I've run smack into this. So I was teaching a communication and technology course, graduate course at DePaul University. It was in the pandemic. So we were using VR headsets, I drove them to all the students' apartments and dropped them off. And that was great fun. But I had a student who, you know, reached out to me. I'm so glad they did. And they said, so we have to create an avatar and I'm non-binary. And I was like, the first thing you have to do here is choose a gender. There's no, in this particular program, there's no genderless option. And it's such an easy thing, right? And so we had to talk through, you know, some of the options and things. And because it was a common tech course and a graduate student, you know, this student actually like kind of pulled out a really nice like paper that addressed a lot of these issues, but like they shouldn't have to, right? And then you have issues of Bree McEwan at University of Illinois Chicago has some great work on inclusivity in these spaces and even things like hairstyles. And some of it's just in like the conversation. Some articles there. We had some folks at Questioning Reality last year who definitely have some work on this kind of idea of inclusivity, but you have this sort of built world and you want it to be available for everyone, but we have miles to go on inclusion in these particular areas, and it comes out in really weird ways sometimes. And I think in terms of the agents, there's, you know, there's potential to sort of like in-group, out-group, and out-grouping the agent. But then I could also see it like, you know, what we do when we argue with people, when people argue online, like, well, you're just a bot, or you're a plant. You know, you're this, so I don't have to believe you because you're some sort of out-group member. And it would be fairly, you know, we could see these things probably replicating in VR, and it would be nice if the industry would kind of get ahead of it. I'm not sure that they will. My plug though is for a group called XR Women. And one of the founders is actually in Mississauga, and they do, it's much more of an industry group than an academic group, but they do talks, I think, every Wednesday, where they bring people in different topics and things, but a lot of their things deal with, how do we represent gender in the metaverse, and how do we, deal with harassment and all of these kinds of things. And so it's kind of nice to have at least that perspective versus the like all tech bro all the time kind of perspective. But yeah.
Thank you so much, Bree. As long as that seminar series doesn't conflict with ours, we'll allow the endorsement.
True.
I'm just kidding. Okay, so I think we're out of time. I actually had some questions as well, but I know we'll have a chance to talk offline. So I just want to end by saying thank you very much, Bree, for your excellent presentation. Thanks to everyone in the audience for being with us today, for asking questions. This concludes our seminar, and please join us next week